I think I've said most of my main stuff, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Barclay. We'll now have a round of questions and comments. No. No. Oh, yeah.
So this is a question for Kivanc. I found this a really interesting paper and found the argument about the capping of taxation really compelling. But I was puzzled by the link to economic development, because it seems to me, and in a way this follows on Jeffrey's comments, that there are many different ways that local elites can extract surpluses from local populations. And taxation is only one of them. Obvious others are banking services, financial services, mercantile services, and other kinds of services that allow them to extract profits. And from that perspective, one might even hypothesize that capping taxation and forcing people to extract surpluses in other ways might actually be more conducive to economic development. So this just, so that it wasn't, suggests to me that just that the opportunities were not there.
Thank you. Richard, and then we'll go back there.
I have a question for Saeed. I enjoyed your paper a lot. I think it's a very fine paper. But my question, actually two questions, are more general. You are part of a group that have studied civilizations for quite some time, which includes people like Shmuel Eisenstadt, Björn Wittrock, etc. So what I wonder is that, has this group, with its focus on civilizations, have you looked at all on the relationship between civilization and economies apart from your paper? That's my first question. My second question is this, that at this conference, civilizations means by default religions, apparently, or more precisely world religions, as Weber calls it, although Weber doesn't use the term civilization. So are we really talking about world religions, or are we talking about civilizations? Anyway, unless what we are looking at this conference is of purely historical interest, what are the modern civilizations? Is there a Western civilization? According to your group, Shmuel Eisenstadt have talked about modernization being the civilization of our time. So I know it's sort of a broad question, but I want to sort of bring back a little bit of the conference to the issue of civilization. Yeah.
Dan.
So I have two questions, one for Kivanc, and one for Mateen. Kivanc, it seems to me that your model is very dependent on, your analysis is very dependent on the fact that taxes were collected in kind. That if taxes were collected in cash, you'd expect the center to set very high tax rates and then require the provincial administrators or governors to just remit 90% of or 95% of whatever they do. That they're only restricted to this low tax rate because taxes have to be collected in kind. There's limits to what can be sent to the center in kind. And so my question is this: first of all, why are there limits to what can be sent to in kind? I mean, is shipping, you can send a lot of grain to Istanbul pretty easily. And second, why are you restricted to in kind? In Europe, and what I know best, England, by the 12th century, you're converting almost all these things into cash. Taxation is in cash. Military service, you mentioned the 40-day limit. That's completely obsolete by the mid-14th century in England. It's all commuted to cash. What's the restraint on the ability to convert these taxes into cash, and therefore to have a fully extractive predatory regime? And then for Mateen, I wonder whether in part your analysis is based on what seems to me a misunderstanding of the constraints on government in Europe. And again, I draw on England, which is what I know best. But I don't think it's the legal community which is the constraint on the government's power to tax. The constraint, at least in England, is the power of people, whether it's in the earlier period barons or other powerful people in later periods, to revolt. You alluded to the Boston Tea Party in America. It's not the lawyers who caused problems for the British in America. It's the fact that you have a popular mass resistance which causes problems. And in England, it's the barons revolting in 1214. It's the opposition to Henry III in the 13th century. It's the Parliament waging war against the king in the Civil War. It's the power of Parliament to evict the Stuart kings in the Glorious Revolution. And law is really a product of those revolts. Those constraints are the product of the underlying power dynamics, and the lawyers can sometimes be the representatives and the people who enunciate the new power regime and can formalize it, but it's really not the legal community which constrains. It's the underlying power of other people, powerful people, essentially through the power to revolt, which constrains. So the question for me is, who had the power to revolt in the Ottoman Empire? And what's interesting about the development, at least in England, is the interest in the desire to revolt is often linked to these constitutional questions. So you revolt, the barons revolt against King John in large part because he's going beyond what's seen as the customary restraints on taxation. And similarly, in the Stuart era, you see they eject James II in part because he's seen as going beyond what's seen as the proper constitutional bounds of the monarch. And so it's this relationship between rebellion linked to an understanding of the proper constitution. So my question to you is, well, you have these people writing books about the proper bounds of taxation in the Ottoman Empire. Well, is anybody prepared to revolt when the Sultan goes beyond those bounds? And if not, why not? That seems to me is the real constraint on the sovereign, not the legal community itself. It's the legal community in its ability, through its ability to serve as the focal point and setting up what it is that is going to cause people who actually have military force to revolt.
There's still lots of questions, I see, but let's finish this round. We'll have more rounds and give the speakers a chance to respond. Try to be concise. These are very broad questions. Saeed, let's start with you.
Okay. I'll try to be concise. Well, as I said, my sense of failure would have been more devastating had I finished the paper, because it would have got a lot more theoretical than it was. And so so it's just as well that I stopped there. But let me address why I failed. I tried to really shift the thing away from capitalism along the lines of the civilizational analysis paradigm. And I failed. I didn't mention capitalism once, Rise of Capitalism. I'm surprised you read it into. In the papers, I have 4 examples. Only one of them has to do with Turner saying that something had to do, ethic did or did not have to do something with Rise of Capitalism. The other examples I give of this overlap, the intertwining of influence, developmental patterns in one field influencing other, have nothing to do with capitalism. None of them mention it on page 2 of the paper. And similarly, I think you said the notion, you said that, am I reading the nation-state thing back into it? Absolutely not. There again, I think, following, if you like, this broad civilizational analysis pattern, what I do in that paper is describe my model, which is what I call patrimonial bureaucratic model that I didn't have time to talk about, halfway between Weber's bureaucracy model and patrimonialism. I mentioned the Ottoman inner-outer service. I also have these functionaries list from the Safavid that make no distinction between household. Now, within this, then, I try to look not at all about to capitalism, but what difference did the changing conception of monarchy within the Skiernos family of patrimonial bureaucratic empires made? And that's what I was going on about. And then later on I said that out of this you have a curious, totally unprecedented development of religious or hierocratic authority, which then creates a powerful group for enforcing a direct impact, or being a channel for direct impact of Shiism on the people. I was trying to be deliberately broad and talked about civic and economic activity rather than economic one particularly. And my assessments are kind of vague, admittedly, but they were never whether or not it would lead to capitalism. The example I gave, of course, no, of course they were not enforced, this ban on people walking on the rainy days. But it made the minorities much more vulnerable. Forced conversion, of course, had a much more direct effect and harmful one. But even these totally unenforced bans allowed these royal slaves to go to the merchant and exact much more money than they would have been able to. You need protection against the mullahs. So I think that's the sort of logic of the argument, which I think brings me to Richard's point. No. The answer is no. I think he can't take my invitation back. The civilization analysis people have not talked about the impact on the economy much. In fact, Eisenstadt's starting point was if you remember, in *68, he said that Protestant ethic thesis is too narrow. We look at the basic premises of a civilization as an impact on all spheres of life, maybe economics included as one rather than as a primary sphere. And he's built his models for the past 45 years since then, and we've gone along to some extent with that, and that's why I think law is much more important that unfortunately I didn't have time to talk about, and I know there are a lot of lawyers. But if I may make myself unpopular, but much less so than suggesting that we have one full theory after, one full session after dinner to go back to the first theoretical session. That would be less popular than taking 30 seconds now. And trying to return Richard's compliment by asking Metin, we're going to talk about this much later, but I think I want Metin to reflect on one of the points that Richard makes in his theoretical thing. And Weber said there are two uses for rationality and ideal type, formalized ideal type models. One is to look at deviations from them, and secondly, whether or not they're applicable. I think the applicability, especially with the Umayyad period, was raised by the commentator. The large number of people were not converted. For that period, it may be that you need a consumption, a distribution function, and not a taxation function. The Muslims didn't pay any taxes. They wrote their names, and they were only 10% of the population, and the Haraj was collected according to totally traditional, extremely rigid customary law. I don't think the Umayyad had anything. But what I would like to ask, I mean, that's an easy one. Maybe there are other factors that you should have taken into. But the one to reflect is, how would you use your model to think of deviations from it? Because I think that's part, if you want to push the civilizational paradigm, it's good to have abstract ideal type models from economics and other disciplines, but then you have to kind of work a lot on this, on fitting it in.
Thank you, Saeed. Kavanch.
So were there only two
Can you use the microphone, please?
Right.
Yeah.
The first question was, were there only two parties? Of course not. When I say delegates, you have delegates of different levels, delegates who have fiefs of different size all around the country. But then again, it's again a first order assumption, and in this period, the historians talk about a polarization between the central administration, which was staffed by the new slave elite, versus the former Turkoman aristocracy, who were uneasy about the shift in political power. So it's a point to start with, and right. So, but right, in the long run, for example, in the 17th and 18th century, this division between provincial elites was much more felt, and the center actually played them against each other. So that's a whole different story. But in this period, I think it's a useful approximation. In each province was the setup the same. I wasn't very clear on that. The model that I described is limited to the core lands of the empire. By that I mean pretty much Western Anatolia and Central Anatolia, and the core lands in the Balkans. So in that sense, and that's one of the reasons we quote different rates with Professor Joshka in the paper. So, and these core lands were basically where the Ottoman power base, and where the central administration raised most of its revenue. So in this sense, right, there were differences. There was more indirect rule in other provinces in the empire. For example, in Egypt, the Ottomans relied extensively until Mehmed Ali. They relied extensively on local Mamluk elites. But the characterization that I presented here is captures at least the power base of the empire and the core lands of the empire. Were there differences in tax rates? For these core lands throughout this period, we see convergence to similar tax rates. When Ottomans conquered a new region, at first they didn't meddle with the tax rates too much, but in particular in this period, what they do is they undertake an explicit project to standardize the tax rate, the obligations in different provinces in the core land. So in that sense, right, the tax rates were pretty much standardized. What is Sipahi? Is he a tax farmer? No, he is not a tax farmer. He is basically the representative of the state who collects taxes in kind and then converts it to mounted soldiers and serves on the battlefield. So he doesn't remit cash to the central administration. He's not a tax farmer. And it's in a way very similar to what happens in feudal Europe, and that also connects to the other question. The discussion it was an excellent question. The discussion I presented relied extensively on this notion that the delegate collected taxes in kind and then converted into coercive force at the location of collection so that he could bargain with the central administration, leveraging that coercive force he had access to. And the question is, why did they collect taxes in kind? I don't have a very good answer to that. It's something to be investigated, but I'll observe the following. In the second half of the 16th century, there is evidence of increasing monetization of the economy, and that is one of the reasons that's counted for why the equilibrium that I described broke down. And I'll also make the comment that even though in this version my argument depended on this assumption that the taxes were collected in kind, this bargaining between center versus provincial elites is a very general argument, kind of. This bargaining and the adjusting taxation to account for it, it's a very general argument. So I would argue that you could come up with, for other cases where taxes were collected in kind, you could come up with a scenario where you have a similar sort of process going on. Land quality and climate. Once again, I'm talking about the Anatolia and the Balkans, and what I read in the literature is that for these regions, the land quality and climate is not much worse than Europe, parts of Europe that I compared the Ottomans to. Even if it was, it wouldn't explain the changes in the tax rate in the Ottoman land. So even if we would expect the climate and the quality of soil to stay constant for the 200 years, more or less constant for the 200 years that I'm describing. Yet in the beginning, beginning is more unclear, but at least at the end there's a rapid jump, and we know that Ottoman tax rates were much lower than what the pre-Ottoman states in the same region extracted.
Kıvanç, why don't we give Metin a chance now and you come back in the second round, maybe. Metin.
Okay. In the interest, I appreciate all questions, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to answer a couple of them that I know the answers for, and others I'll take it to heart and keep thinking about them. Part of it is because we are covering so much ground, and this is really a paper. Some of it I have to defer to my co-authors and so on. And when you do this kind of sweeping generalizations, of course, there are some exceptions that don't fit in the story, and so I'm not going to defend that at all. In terms, there are just a few things. In terms of the what seems to be a contradiction between the two papers, I'm arguing the tax rates were high, and he's arguing they were low. And this is just an empirical matter, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I've studied Ottoman taxes for some time now, and I think they're high. Moreover, it's not just the tax rate that's at stake here; it's taxes relative to expenditure. Now, you can have countries where the taxes are high, but if you're all getting it back in form of expenditures, those taxes are not necessarily high. Okay, you're paying for it. So, and here, and I think the discussant pointed out, you have to look at land values and the services and what is being taken in return. The number alone, the tax rate, doesn't say much. You have to put it in the context. And in terms of the tax rates rising in the 17th century, I don't know of any evidence of that either. Maybe I'm missing something. The other question, Dan's question on why I'm looking at the legal community, only because of our focus on the law, really. And maybe I set it up the wrong way. The general question why West and not, what didn't happen. And I could have asked the question in terms of political system and so on. In other papers I've looked at in tax collection, tax system in general, what kinds of constraints there were. Here I'm just looking at the legal community because once I started looking at this, I was very intrigued by this the group of legal community called the ulama. Its economics of it is very much understudied. We don't really know what their role was in the overall functioning of the system, and they wielded so much power. They still do. Okay. A lot of powerful folks in the Middle East, they are actually really just ulama. Not elected officials or anything like that. So it's economics of it in the economic underdevelopment or the current economic well-being of is not studied. So I was intrigued by that. So I take your comments. I could have looked at the political system and will. Here I just didn't get into that. You asked the question of whether there was revolts. Yes, there were. In the 16th century especially, there are a lot of Jalali revolts. But the causes of them are quite mixed. The 16th century is a funny time. There is population is rising, there is urbanization, there is all sorts of things happening, not just in the Ottoman Empire. We know it's happening throughout the world. And it's causing all sorts of revolts in all sorts of places. And the cause of it is mixed with tax. So I don't want to give too much credit to that. I'll just stop at that.
Okay, let's have another round. We'll start with the people who had their hands up before. Molly? Can you use the microphone, please? Yeah.
I wanted to come back to Dan's point, which I thought was a good one, and this is addressed primarily to Metin, although Kivanc might have some thoughts on it. Metin said the Ottomans never had a Boston Tea Party because they were smart, yes, I was surprised by your emphasis on the law, because you and Kivanc to a certain extent keep coming back to it seems the self-restraint that the Ottomans exercised. So it's not the role of the ulama, it's simply that the Ottomans chose not to follow policies that would have perhaps led to the Boston Tea Party. And so I'd like you to ask you if you think we should pay more attention to this, and particularly writing on, sort of the latest writing on the Ottoman 17th and 18th centuries emphasizes the Ottoman unwillingness compared to Western states. I'm surprised that we talk about the strong state in the Middle East, because what's striking in the Middle East or in the Ottoman Empire is the unwillingness of the state to squeeze the peasantry in the way that it does in the West, and the unwillingness to crush opposition entirely. Rather, there seems to be more of a push for equilibrium. And as in Karen Barkey's book, she says, how come we don't have these peasant revolts in the 17th and 18th centuries? Instead, we have banditry, and the Ottomans are very, very good at buying off and incorporating the bandits. So this seems to me to be, we should look at the Ottoman state on its own terms, rather than assuming this sort of strong state model that states will always do as much as they can, and we need lawyers to restrain them, or law.
Sinan.
Well, drawing on that point and on Clerman's earlier points, I want to suggest a comparison. This is to Joshka about the rise of the Roman lawyers in Europe in the time of the reception. You see an emergence of the of an autonomous group of lawyers, but they are in service of rulers. So they are working actually. There is a good job market for these lawyers. In public service, but I think the major difference is, and this is Joel Mokyr talks about this, about the Enlightenment. There is no empire, so you have different countries kind of competing for these lawyers. So, and if one lawyer loses a job with one ruler, he can go and seek for another job in another country. So that kind of adds to the autonomy of these lawyers. But in terms of the legal community being in the service of the rulers, I think it's the same for at least for the time of the reception in Europe. All these lawyers are working for the state, and actually the rise of the law in Europe is precisely due to this to the employment of the lawyers by the state. So not because law has its own autonomous, creates its own autonomous community. And a link to that, if you look at the Ottoman Empire, you know most of the lawyers come out of madrasas which are not actually funded directly by the state, but through religious endowments, which have kind of a autonomous status from the state. So, and which goes back to Molly's point about that maybe the Ottomans were unwilling to provide public goods because it was not their business to do. And most of education, for example, when you talk about expenditure, I'm intrigued as where expenditure goes in the Ottoman Empire, because most of the public goods we know were provided by religious endowments and not by the state.
Thank you, Sinan. Mikhail?
This is a more general methodological comment, actually, maybe for the organizers more than anything else. It relates to the point I think Richard made, but also to Said's point a little bit. I learn a lot from these papers about the interaction between civilizations and economy and all of this. The concern I have is that there is an implicit, sometimes explicit comparison with Western Europe as being the kind of idealized, industrialized model against which we compare. And in some cases, the comparison is very obvious. It's failure and so forth. Now, the idealized version of Western Europe is something against you can't win, because it's an idealized construct. So, and it doesn't exist. So if we are going to have some kind of comparison, it would be more fruitful to me, I think, to maybe bring it down a level. You suggested yesterday like more mid-level social theoretical comparisons. Because we are comparing a real situation in a real country with all of these papers, but yet what's implicit in the comparison is an idealized situation in Western Europe, which in itself is a larger unit than each of these countries when they were actually industrializing. And of course, as someone who does Japan, one could argue that there are other models against which one could compare on a lower level, Japan being one of them. So I think it's a methodological problem that at some point the organizers may have to address and think about, because I conceive it as being a weakness in trying to compare anything to this idealized model, because we know it's successful and it's idealized to start with. How can anything measure up to it? It just doesn't work.
Okay, let's take one more. Thank you, Jean-Philippe.
Yes, it's a little bit in the same line. If I'm well informed, the highest tax rate which has ever been observed in modern times in Western Europe were in the Netherlands and followed by United Kingdom. But this was due to the fact that there were heavily expensive wars to be waged against France. But the people were backing this national effort against France very strongly. So what I mean to say is the following, is that looking just at the level of the tax rate doesn't really point to whether the regime is autocratic or democratic or whatever. I think this is a completely different question. And I think in the kind of theoretical framework that you have, Metin, the problem really hinges upon the fact that you have constant expenditures. But expenditures are endogenous. And this is the problem. So when you compare to contexts like Western Europe and the Ottoman Empire, for instance, I think one should have the possibility that expenditure, let's say, for instance, increases with tax rates, and that doesn't say anything about the kind of political regime that we have.
Let's get some quick reactions from the speakers, and hopefully we'll be able to get another round. Okay. Starting, yes, Said.
Quick, just I think Mikhail's question actually allows me to answer Richard's second one, which is really related to it, that I didn't answer the second question. What did the civilization and analysis paradigm put in the place of rise of capitalism? I think Eisenstadt, what you mentioned, he talks about, in very vague terms, civilization of modernity. So that's instead of capitalism. Now, he says that there's a composite new civilization that has its own premises like these other things that premises that came from Western Europe, but they're generalized. Now, that doesn't really get over the problem raised there, because the centrality of Western Europe really becomes disguised slightly as this new civilization of modernity. So, you would say, of course, that then how do you relate it to economics? Well, that kind of, you could then say that with economic globalization, this rationalizing pattern in the economy tend to spill over to other fields of life much more than they did in the pre-modern, other civilizational patterns. You could do something with that, which is not useless. It's quite interesting. But I think pragmatically, I would support that idea of getting lower. I mean, it's good to have a theoretical vision in the back of your mind, but really the empirically based things at that level and other comparisons that would be very useful.
Okay, thank you. Kıvanç, again, if you could be concise, we'll have time for some more questions.
I mean, okay, so I didn't really have a question this round, but I want to answer once I said from the previous one, where the discussion was ways to extract, whether there were ways to extract resources from the countryside other than taxation. And that question implicitly assumes that, once again, you had landed elites in the Ottoman Empire, similar to what they had in Europe or what was before the period I'm talking about. But what happens in this period is you see so it's in a way a long-term effect of this short-term policy. You see the disappearance of landed elites that have roots in a particular region, and basically by the end of the period, the officials that I'm talking about, this governing class, is rotated around the country, and they don't stay at a region for more than 7 years. So this is the period where kind of the landed elites in the Ottomans disappear, and they never come back. They make a partial comeback in the 18th century, but they never make a full comeback. I'll also make a brief remark about the question about implicit comparison to Europe. At least in my case, I gave statistics, and now in the discussion I refer to Europe. But other than that, I think the way to go is to construct an argument in a formal way. And of course you have to refer to Europe because that's kind of the only region that succeeded in breaking this cycle as data or as empirical evidence. But other than that, the argument that I try to present, or the methodology that I'm trying to adopt, is kind of uses the words like incentives, whether they have incentive to invest, whether they have incentive to charge high tax rate or low tax rate, and none of this is I mean, when you use neutral words like that, I don't think it necessarily implies a comparison with Europe.
Thank you, Kıvanç. Metin.
Okay, again, in the interest of time, I will just be brief, and if I don't answer your question, I apologize. I just maybe I misunderstood. In terms of the Mali, your point about Ottomans buying off bandits and so on, and I don't have time or space in the paper to comment on that, but certainly it's consistent with my argument about how the Ottomans were able to control the legal community. They basically turned them into bureaucrats, and it's not true, Sinan, that that the legal community, you could become a member of this legal community among the powerful, like qadis and so on in the hierarchy, that you could just come from private waqfs. You could be trained in those, and the Ottomans made sure to restrict entry to those schools that they were in charge of. That was their way of, and they turned this whole, they did actually the same thing to Sipahis and so on. I could tell the same story about Ottomans' ability. At the risk of giving them too much credit, they were pretty smart about turning their threat into allies by aligning their incentives. Now, I'll have to talk to you about the Roman lawyers and Mokir's point. There is more detail than I can talk about right now. In terms of comparison with the West, I'm just going to comment that I was very explicit about it, only because the question of why West is the one that we spend a lot of time talking, economic historians have done, and I am just asking the other side of the question, assuming that's an important question to ask. Now, the question about that Richard also mentioned yesterday, this is capital C versus little c. I have ideas on that. If we have the final session, perhaps I can bring them up. We could think about something capital C as the ideal civilization, and we can bid Western civilization, Chinese, whatever, against that. In that ranking, and I think we would all agree that Western civilization happens to be close to, so because we don't really have a good handle on what that is, we just bid it against that. I think, in a nutshell, that in terms of Jean-Philippe's, just one little thing, point about tax rates should be constant in relation to expenditures. I try to do that in the model. In the paper, rather, it's determining both tax rates and so on. But then I focus on expenditures, assuming on the tax rates, assuming the expenditure side sort of is understood. We just didn't get into partly also because we don't really have much information on expenditures. They were just like consumption. We don't know much about it. We know the income side better. But
Barclay, you want to come in? If you could be very brief.
Yeah, I'll take my minute that I gave up, and I want to talk about the really big question that Swedberg and some other people were bringing up, which is how do we define civilizations, and is it religion? One of the new trends in comparative economic systems is to do cluster analysis. Frederick Pryor is doing this. So you look at a whole bunch of things and you see how they cluster. We won't worry about that. Religion's part of it. Other things are part of it. I think part of it is also an issue of self-identity. So sometimes it becomes nations like Japan or China, which you cannot necessarily pin down to religion. But in a lot of cases, it does seem to be tied to religion. I think Weber is right there. A lot of it is. And a lot of it also has to do with this self-identification. I mean, there are people in Egypt right now who are suddenly realizing that they sort of revered both Sunnis and Shias, and now suddenly they're being forced to, maybe we shouldn't be going around being nice to Shias and recognizing their stuff. And of course, finally, back to modernity, there's the old Weber thesis. I mean, where did this modernity civilization come from? Well, it's Britain and the United States, and that is ultimately Protestant-dominated branch of religions.
Okay, we've run out of time. I know there were lots of other questions, but let's take a 15-minute break.